This is my 10th video on my attempts to construct a small 00 gauge layout. See part 1 for my reasons for doing this, and my lengthy series on my N-gauge railway modelling for more interesting stuff with trains actually running, etc. This part deals with a couple of fairly quick builds from plastic kits, a ratio footbridge and an Airfix water tower. I'm still building quite a bit of stuff from kits for the 00 gauge layout, as it's still in a fairly raw early state. I've got several more card buildings coming up, but I thought I'd take a bit of a break from card buildings to do a couple of fairly simple plastic kits of railway accessories. I picked up both of these kits essentially by chance because they happened to be on offer from local suppliers I visited, the prices were reasonable, and they looked as if they could well find a place on my 00 gauge layout. The first kit here is a ratio footbridge. Despite the label, I actually picked this up from Tiny Railroads in Delhi, Ontario. I've often found ratio kits complex and difficult to build, sometimes with many extremely tiny parts and little help towards assembling them in the way of such things as locator pins or fitting flanges. This kit, however, did not really appear at all like that. It seemed to be fairly straightforward and simple, consisting only of 4 sprues, mostly with fairly substantial parts. The stairways, for example, came in this case as single parts, whereas other ratio kits I've worked on expected you to build stairways by gluing individual parts for each step to a side frame with no locator grooves. The one gesture this kit had towards some of the odder ratio practices was that a blank sheet of clear acetate was supplied, and it was suggested that you might like to cut individual glazing pieces for the sides of the lamp heads from this. There were grooves in the landing pieces into which the side pieces fitted, and assembling the main span with landings on either end presented no real problems, so long as you were careful to distinguish between the rather similar pieces for the side walls of the landings. Then supporting frames could be fitted under the landings. A large part of my time building this kit was spent removing all the gates and overflows and cleaning up the pieces for assembly. But the many gates and overflows did result in almost all of the parts being cast very crisply with almost no flash at all. The instructions were not very full, consisting mainly just of an exploded diagram, but they did suggest attaching the main stairways last and taking care with them. I elected to glue the outer walls of the stairways to the landing walls first to establish the slope and ensure a clean fit of those walls, which would be the most visible. Then I glued the stairs themselves to the outer walls and the landings, and then finally glued on the inner walls to the stairs and the landing walls. It was a little tricky to get all of this to fit okay. Doing it this way, the worst fit was on the join of the inner walls, where it would probably be the least visible. The smallest parts in this kit were for lamps on the landings. I didn't try to cut acetate glazing for them. I'll just end up painting the glazed parts silver, probably. Each lamp consists of 3 parts, unless you add glazing: the main body, a base, and a top. Here I've glued the lamps together, a darn sight easier than some other ratio lamps I've worked with. Of course it helps being 00 gauge and hence much larger than N gauge, where most of my previous work with ratio has been in N gauge. The lamps then go on top of the posts at the corners of the landings. There are also smoke deflectors seen underneath the bridge here, but it doesn't really make sense to glue those on until you know exactly how the bridge is going to fit over your track, since the smoke deflectors should be aligned with the track. I fiddled around trying to figure out where I could put this bridge on my layout. There wasn't really any very sensible place for it. It would sit most naturally from platform to platform on a station with 2 platforms with 2 tracks between the platforms. But I don't have that on my layout, so I had to shoehorn this bridge in somehow, and to do that I needed to create a dedicated small platform for one end of the bridge, since I only have single platform stations. I did this using the Metcalfe stone platform kit. I cut a piece of asphalt topping for a small platform with a ramp and glued the thin heavy card edging strips round that. Then I made platform sides by gluing heavy card backing to the printed parts and glued those in place all round the platform behind the edging pieces with supports to keep the edging walls vertical. This created a small platform with a ramp. Then I just put the Metcalfe self-adhesive edging strips all round that. And this is how I fitted the bridge onto the layout. Not exactly ideal, but if I'm going to use it at all, this is about the only place it can go. Of course it needs to be painted and weathered to finish it off, but I've left that for now. The other plastic kit I built was this Airfix water tower, which I picked up because I happened to see it on a shelf when visiting British model trains in Cambridge, Ontario. And if truth be told, because I just have a random nostalgia for Airfix kits as I built so many of them as a boy. This kit is actually still available under the Dapol brand. It's actually a bit simpler than it appears here, as it turned out that a couple of the sprues of parts that came in my box didn't actually belong to this kit. The only really tricky thing about this kit was these side supports for the legs of the tank. The instructions tell you to assemble these first and indicate that you must get the spacing of the ends of the struts to be 51mm, so I marked that on a piece of paper to help with the assembly. The struts do fit into grooves in the circular central pieces, but that fit is not snug, and the spacing of 51mm is by no means particularly fixed or natural. Both ends of the longer side struts are supposed to be spaced 51mm at their ends. There are also shorter struts for the ends of the frame, and it's important that you take care to distinguish between the various strut pieces as you assemble them. I actually decided to leave assembling the end struts for a bit, as I felt, given the awkwardness of the fit, that it would actually be better to still have the glue on the struts not entirely set when it came to trying to fit everything together with the legs, so there would still be some play when trying to get everything to go together. So I skipped to assembling the parts below the tank at this point. I assembled this main water pipe first, as this needs to be fitted precisely with the height of the tank from the ground. The base of the tank gets a framework of girders before it is assembled with the legs. First I glued on these side girders. They must go the right way up, so that the pins on one side fit into the base of the tank, and the pins on the other side, which are differently spaced, face down to attach the brackets for the legs. Once the side girders are in place, the end and cross girders can be fitted. Again, it is important to distinguish between the similar pieces. In fact, I first glued one of the central cross girders on at the end, and then realized that was wrong and had to pull it off before the glue set, fortunately, and re-glue it in its proper place. Once all of the girders are in place, small triangular bracket pieces go onto the corners, set in place by locator pins to connect with the legs. Then the legs have to go on with the bracing support struts between them. This is frankly a devil to do, as you're trying to connect the legs to the brackets on the tank base at the same time as all of the four struts are connected to the legs, and none of these connections is terribly positive. Pins on the ends of the legs go into holes in the brackets, and the ends of the bracing struts go into sort of grooves in the legs. But nothing snaps in tight and holds there. It's strictly the gluing that's going to hold everything together. And trying to get it into form and hold it in form until the glue sets enough to support it is, well, let's just say somewhat challenging. And of course you're not done when you get the legs on one side done. You've then got to do the same thing for the other side. And then you've got to get the end bracing struts into place without messing up what you've already done. Definitely a bit of a challenge to get all of these wobbly struts glued together to form a framework that looks reasonably symmetrical and square. And after I'd done all that, I realized I'd put the legs on upside down. The fat ends of the legs are actually intended to go at the top, attached to the brackets under the tank. But by the time I realized that, the glue had set to a point where it just didn't seem worth trying to get the legs off, so I left things the way they were and put the rectangular feet onto the fat ends of the legs, which I had at the bottom. This perhaps looks a little odd, but I'm not sure anyone would really notice it as a problem. Finally, having established how far off the ground the tank was going to sit, I glued in the main water pipe. Actually, the pipe was barely long enough to glue into the base of the tank and reach the ground. If I glued it with the top of the pipe flush with the inside of the tank, then the pipe wouldn't have reached the ground, which would have tended to look stupid. Now the side walls of the tank can be glued on. These go together quite nicely, with grooves and supporting flanges assisting the fit. And then the roof of the tank is glued in place, again a nice positive fit. At this point I realised that this sprue of parts had no function in assembling the water tank. I have no idea what kit they belong with. There appears to be a hose of some sort and wheels with supports. The only things remaining for the water tank are the inspection cover with its railings and access ladder. The railing is assembled from 3 parts and fitted to the tank roof. It all goes together with pins gluing into holes, making assembly simple, as tends to be the case with Airfix kits. The instructions imply that the 2 parts of the ladder somehow go together with a stepped join. I didn't find this really to be the case. The ends that go together are where the parts are cut from the sprue, but I didn't see any attempt to mould steps into those parts. I just sanded them flat to clean up from the sprue attachment and then glued them end to end. The top of the ladder has 2 pins which fit into holes in the tank, so there's no real ambiguity about its place. It is barely long enough to reach the ground. I didn't get very fancy with regards to finishing this tank. I just sprayed it with a pale green acrylic paint and then used some mineral spirits with black and brown enamel to weather it. I just washed over the tank with mineral spirits and, a little black and brown enamel on the brush. Here it is after drying. I've done better weathering jobs than this, I must say, but it doesn't look too bad. Here it is without flash, which is probably more representative of its natural appearance. I did just paint the main water cock black at this point. And here is the tank on the layout in the yard by the central terminal station by the engine shed. This seemed the most reasonable place for it. I do need to put a water crane beside it, as the tank wouldn't be much use without some way of using the water for locos. So there you are, a couple more odd items built for my 00 gauge layout.